Great. Thank you very much, Carolyn. And thank you all for attending and the panelists for coming and sharing our expertise. I thought we might kick it off by introducing ourselves. I can go first to model what we were hoping for that to look like. So my name is Chris Stewart. I am a senior computational linguist at Google and a research associate at the University of Memphis's Institute for Intelligent Systems. I have a PhD from a French department, which, it's been quite a trip. Probably not a lot of, I'm probably relatively unique in that sense. I've worked in academia on the tenure track in a modern languages department, worked as a senior data scientist and a voice engineer doing text-to-speech synthesis stuff. And now, just like everyone else in the universe, it seems like working on things related to LLMs, not really directly, but on applications. So, Mark, would you like to go next, maybe?
Yeah, sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Mark. I have a PhD in linguistics from UC Santa Cruz. After that, I was a professor for 5 years at the University of Oklahoma, teaching linguistics classes to undergraduates. And then I made a switch to the tech industry. I had a brief position as a contractor at Amazon working with chatbot data before I started working at Grammarly just like 3.5 years ago or so. As an analytical linguist at Grammarly, this job means basically mixed methods. So some automatic stuff, some manual stuff, some qualitative stuff, some quantitative stuff. And I've been doing prompt engineering work since the beginning of 2023.
So, Carolyn or Claire, if you'd like to go next, feel free.
I can go. Hi, everyone. I'm Claire. I got my master's in linguistics at the University of Ottawa. After that, I worked for a startup for a bit as a computational linguist, then was a professor for a semester to teach computation in linguistics. And then I did some contract work for Meta with specifically like prompt engineering and just working with their LLM data. And then as of about a month ago, I am now an AI engineer at Magnet Forensics, doing similar prompt engineering, linguistics analysis work.
And hi, I'm Caroline. I got my bachelor's from Princeton in linguistics and visual arts. And I started off my career working at a healthcare company as a product manager, focusing on a variety of different data and tech and research stuff on their clinical side, but then mostly working on an AI model project, which was a predictive model to identify high-risk cases using some of the NLP work that I had started during my undergraduate research. And then for the last 2 years, I've been working at NVIDIA as a product manager on our data strategy team. So working on designing and collecting data sets for a variety of different AI models, mostly speech AI, and then retrieval augmented generation.
Cool. Well, it's great to have such a nice variety of experience here. So one thing that I have been talking about with a few people is this question that I think many people have, which is where do linguists fit in? Where does linguistics fit in prompt engineering? Does what you do now have anything to do with linguistics, or doesn't have much to do with linguistics? Would any of you like to speak to that?
Yeah, I can quickly. The way I see where linguistics are in this kind of new age of LLMs and everything is really to help computer scientists and the people writing the nitty-gritty code in the background of like helping them understand what the output is, because specifically with LLMs and with prompts, like the output's going to be different every single time. And computer scientists basically just don't know what to do sometimes. I find they are very like used to having calculated metrics that give them a number to say, hey, this is how good the output was. But you can't do that with non-deterministic outputs. So linguists are really been trained to understand non-deterministic outputs, see what the patterns are amongst all of the outputs, and be able to say, hey, here's a specific behavior that you're either wanting to see or not wanting to see, and here's how we recommend you improve upon it.
Yeah. Oh, go ahead, Caroline.
Oh, no, go ahead. All good.
Okay, so yeah, I think that yeah, I agree with everything that Claire said. I think that that there is still work that needs to be done to understand the outputs that systems are generating, and whether that is linguistic capabilities, like we're trying to get a prompt that does some linguistic thing to the input, or even in the case of, if it's like a prompt that's just doing classification, but that it's failing in some cases. I always tell people that one of the things that linguists kind of seem to do sort of innately is immediately generalize in a way that I don't always see collaborators doing. They'll get really hung up on one example sometimes. And of course, linguists are always like, okay, but is this a pattern? Because patterns are things we can address, and individual examples, well, okay, there are tools for those too. If they're high severity, you want to be able to knock those out. But in general, when you're developing something, you want to be looking for things that scale and looking for patterns. And while these systems can do anything in a certain sense, you still need to understand the ways in which they're succeeding, and in my opinion, more importantly, the places where they're failing, to see if you can do anything to mitigate that.
Yeah, I would definitely agree. I think there's a number of kind of abstracted skills that linguists have that come in handy a lot, like pattern recognition and generalizability, just general data analysis and system understanding. But I would say one of the biggest things I've noticed is that I think this is a very like broad brush way of painting it, but I think there was a phase and an attitude within machine learning, especially deep learning, around as long as you have high volume of data and you have compute and you have algorithms, you can do whatever you need to. And I think more and more we've come back to the understanding of actually understanding your data is that missing piece. And so experts in data, whether it's healthcare data, it's images, or if it's language data, having those domain experts are super, super helpful, because then you can take what to a lot of AI engineers and AI experts can be just like a black box or this abstract blob that is your data set, and try and break it down into axes and define it in ways you can kind of cover the diversity that you need and the breadth of inputs and outputs you need to take care of. But linguistics really gives you a framework from which to start from. And once you know that, also, you can kind of apply it to non-language data as well.
Okay, that's some excellent. I think that will be very helpful for people. I wonder if we might pivot slightly to I seem to remember about a year, maybe less than a year ago at this point, where in the age of LLMs, things seem to move so fast. But that, there's this quote going around the internet that the hottest new coding language is English. I'm wondering if you all have found that to be true, in the sense that, we've kind of talked in abstract terms up until now, but getting your hands dirty, actually developing things with these models at scale. Do you write code? How does that work? What do people do? Oh, go ahead, Clara.
Yeah. Oh, okay. I guess for me right now, I've started coding a lot more in this AI engineer job. So I would say it's almost 50-50 at this point, because I'm trying to like create a way to evaluate LLMs. So that means there's a little bit of coding involved, but there's also a bit of prompt engineering. So I'm actually switching back and forth between coding and then writing an English prompt in a Word doc. So for me, it's about a 50-50 split right now.
I'll go next because I know, Caroline, you're a product manager, so have different role than we do. So Yeah, I definitely have to do both things. I think that quote is also really interesting because I think it is true that some people approach it in that way. And I've been doing it, I've been doing it for so long that it's still surprising to me to meet people who say, how come when I add to the prompt, this should be less than 20 words? How come it's producing things that are more than 20 words sometimes? Folks haven't quite understood that it doesn't have that same rule-based behavior that code does. And so, right, so that's like a sort of interesting thing. And so as a result, speaking to Claire, talking about evaluating things as well, some stuff needs to be done manually, some stuff needs to be done in an automatic way. And so you want to use both tool sets. There's also a really interesting blog post that I saw from the LinkedIn community, I think it was, where they talked about, for example, they had a prompt that was telling the system to produce JSON structured output. And 90% of the time it's perfect JSON. You can parse it with code, there's no problems, but 10% of the time it fails. Well, then they dug into those errors and they found out actually there are some patterns here. We can write a few post-processing layers on top of this to convert these errors back into parsable JSON, to like tidy up the pipeline a little bit to deal with some of the mistakes that the LLM produces. And so here is back to code. You can, the thing that I think is you can prototype something like that. Just all you need is English and access to an API. But if you're wanting to get that thing ready for general availability, the quality bar is going to be higher if you use more tools to smooth out the kinds of things that the LLM is, the inconsistencies that they can produce.
Yeah, I'll add on just super briefly on that. I think the quote oversimplifies it a bit because I think our robustness is still pretty low. So for most of the time, it's not going to give that smooth experience of you just naturally ask for what you need and the system provides it. I think just like with Googling, we learned how to Google search. And you knew some people who just had an edge. They knew exactly how to kind of frame the question, some of the actual semi-coding things that you could plug in to help you. I think it advantages people that have spent more time with the tool and like understand the underlying system a bit, that you can communicate a lot more precisely. But ideally, we'll get to a point where it's more customized and robust so that it becomes more accessible and usable to people who don't have a lot of experience working with these tools or a lot of understanding of the underlying technology.
Excellent. That's super helpful. And, it strikes me that I hear a lot of times, people, there's kind of this attitude I've heard sometimes of like, just LLM it, just like throw the LLM at it. I'm wondering what you all have found works, and specifically, since we're talking about skills and coding and things like that, maybe to make it very specific, let's talk about what are LLMs generally good at coding and what are they not good at doing? If you wanted to write code to do something, does anyone have any experience with that? Have you ever tried to get an LLM to write Python code or SQL or anything like that? And if so, did it go well? Did it not go well? Has anyone ever tried that? Mark, you're shaking your head. Yes, or like at least you look
Okay.
interested.
Yeah,
so.
sure. I was waiting for you to call on one of us. So, yeah, I mean, that is a thing that has been extremely effective. I think like the hardest, like what is it good at? Well, it's good at a lot of the stuff where you're like, oh, I know that there's a way to do this, but I can't remember the syntax. And so then I will just go over to ask an LLM, or my company has a license for the Copilot product that codes along with you, and it's very good at doing the kind of basic scripting stuff that I need to do, and so that's extremely useful. We don't have any integration like this. Maybe there's someone that does, but every company has its own tech stack and its own technologies and things, and so it doesn't scale to those things as well, right? Because it hasn't been trained on them. And so for those things that are more like deep in the weeds of software engineering, I can imagine that, yeah, maybe it's less effective. But I found for a lot of especially if you're getting started with Python coding and you're like, how can I do it? I mean, you can get a lot of coverage by just writing out, okay, this is what the code is supposed to do. And if it's pretty basic stuff, I've found that it's able to generate it pretty well.
Yeah, it's the exact same way for me. I use like the Copilot every day as well, and it's super nice just to get that low-hanging fruit per se in coding of just like, okay, I need the template done. But the moment you're like, oh, I gotta add this like very niche or very specific feature, that's where it doesn't work as well. Or you could make it generate something that you know isn't going to be good, and then you just build off of that. That's kind of how I use it.
It seems like it is really good at whatever you can find in the textbooks, like whatever a textbook can really capture. But then once you go very custom, very specific, very kind of bespoke to your company or your organization or your code, or it's just like really touching and interacting with a lot of your other technical infrastructure, that's where it reaches its limitations versus when it's like a very, very closed problem. It helps a lot because, again, a lot of the times when I'm just coding on my own, I'm constantly Googling to remember just random pieces of script that I had forgotten.
I think one last note is doc strings as well. It's very good at just writing the documentation you need within your code. I barely read it sometimes. It's just so nice that it's there. So if I come back to the code later, it's written in English, so I know what's going on.
Yeah, it's also kind of amazing that if you're ever working somewhere that has Copilot or you have a license yourself, that even if you just put a comment in your code, you know, the £, and then say, okay, and now I'm going to remove blah, blah. And then you hit return, and then the system is like, writes the code that does that exact thing that you needed it to do. It's kind of funny that way. Also funny, anytime you try to define a string and it automatically has ideas about what that string should be. And I'm just really wondering where that's coming from every time that I'm doing that.
Yeah, it almost feels like magic sometimes. You think, oh, how did you know that that's where I was going? And then sometimes not. Sometimes you think that's not helpful in the slightest, right? It's kind of a mixed bag. So speaking about reaching into niche things, like, you know, that sometimes the LLM has a tough time with, you know, relatively particular things in your job and does better at more generalized things. So Caroline, one of the things that you touched on was RAG, Retrieval Augmented Generation, which is kind of a hot topic these days. Do you want to talk about what that is and what you do with it?
Yeah, sure. So retrieval augmented generation is essentially when you're able to hook up your generator, which could be a singular LLM or it could be a kind of generation system, and you want to connect it to a defined database or set of databases and enable that generation to access information from those databases in order to respond to a prompt or a query. So it's really, really useful rather than having to necessarily fine tune a model, an LLM on your data, which is hard, expensive, and also your data is constantly updating. So it becomes really difficult to keep up with, but also you have increased traceability when you're retrieving from a defined database. It becomes really, really useful, especially for enterprises, to be able to get more reliable information by connecting and kind of augmenting the general knowledge and skill sets of an LLM with very, very hyper-specific, company-specific data. And so it becomes really, really tricky because once you look at company-specific data, it's messy, it's not easy to deal with, and that means that the system is going to struggle with finding the right thing. There are all these nuances that someone who knows a database really well, kind of like a librarian, knows exactly where to find these things, but it's this intrinsic knowledge that's not always well defined. And you have to train your system to pick up on that metadata or those peculiarities and preferences. And you also just have a huge variety of what the data can look like across modalities, across topics. So it's a really, really amazing tool, but I think we're in the early stages of figuring out how much it can help people, how useful it is, but then also how, just from a technical perspective, how the whole system works. I don't know if that was a good explanation.
I think it was great. Yeah, I think it was great.
Mark or Claire, you guys, have you worked with RAG?
Sure, I can say a little bit. We've experimented with a little bit. I think Caroline touched on a lot of the important points, but like I think one of the biggest challenges I've seen is basically relevance. So you know, as a worker, so the grand idea maybe is that I can query a system and say, tell me about Project Gizmo and the latest updates, and it will pull all and only the relevant information that I need, that's new, that's important for what I'm doing, those kinds of things. And that you would like you could do this by basically dumping information into the system or selecting certain bits that exist in the database, right, and giving it to the system. But I found, at least in some of the explorations, I've never been directly involved, but I've seen some things. And you know, I'm a linguist at a tech company, so every time I'm interacting with a new system, I'm kind of trying to break it so we can figure out where it's not working. And you just see sometimes that the system, it sort of helps you appreciate like the way that you are preserving context as a worker, because the system has access to all the same information that you do, but it doesn't process information in the same way, or it didn't unfold over several weeks. It's getting all of it right now. And sometimes it pulls out stuff that's totally irrelevant, or sometimes it pulls out stuff that is dated information because it struggles to get the time scale correctly. And then, of course, we all, or many people have probably heard the term hallucination as well, that sometimes it generates something that's not actually true. So yeah, like I think people are really excited about it, especially in enterprise. I mean, I think as someone, yeah, I think reading about it just to understand the concepts and stuff, even though you wouldn't be able to build a system from scratch, probably be a really wise thing to do right now.
Yeah, I agree with both Mark and Caroline. I haven't used Reg a ton. I actually made a personal project once where I tried to use Reg with my own data set of like my job experience and tried to make like ChatGPT, but that could do interviews for me. So someone could ask this ChatGPT like questions about me, and it would use Reg to try to get information out of like my resume, or I created a data set of just like a ton of random questions someone would be asked in an interview. Um, and yeah, with the hallucination, it always said I spoke Spanish, which I do not at all. So, but because I speak French and English, I think Spanish is just very common to have like the three together. And so I just remember being like, I can't put this out yet. Like, there's no way I can let it hallucinate like that, because that's such a like make or break hallucination. So yeah, Reg is really good. It's just there are still those like kinks that we need to keep working on for sure.
Yeah, it puts me in mind of this story of the attorney who wrote a brief and apparently used, I don't remember which LLM to write the brief, that cited cases that didn't exist. That's what you want to avoid, right? I mean, the model doesn't know, you know, that there are legal cases and there are consequences and, you know, things like that. So ideally, the idea, for those of you who've never heard of RAG, is you would be able to dig into a database of legal cases so that when the model starts, you know, uses its amazing abilities to write fluent English, it references things that actually exist instead of sometimes referencing things that don't exist for reasons particular to the model. I wonder if maybe we could pivot here briefly, because there are two very specific questions that I think people have asked in so far in the LCL that I thought we might touch on here that are related. So one of them is, what are the most important skills to have if you want to be a good prompt engineer? And closely following on that is what the training you need for jobs, and what kind of jobs, what should people be looking for job titles and that sort of thing. Do people advertise for prompt engineers? Is that like something that people recruit for? I see Mark shaking his head. Yes. Yeah. Do you want to go first, Claire? Do you want to tackle this one?
Yeah, sure. so it sounds like there was two parts. For the job title, I would almost avoid looking at the title. That's what I learned I kind of had to do because every company has their own idea of what a prompt engineer is and their own idea of where linguistics sits in their company. So I kind of stopped looking at job titles and focused only on what they were describing and as the job description. So if there was any sort of linguistics in there, I was much more likely to apply. The other little trick I used was where did they place the linguistics degree in their degree requirements? If it's like the very last one, like it was computer science, math, or linguistics degrees, then I would be less inclined to think they wanted a classic linguist compared to like somewhere that has software engineering and a bit of linguistics. I would look for those jobs where it said you want a degree in linguistics or comp sci or math or something. So that was a little trick I used that really helped. I'm forgetting the other part of the question.
So skills and job titles, I think, are
Skills. Yeah. The one skill I always tried to highlight was the ability to communicate to software engineers or like people without a linguistics background that are going to use what you find in their work, being able to explain it in not linguistic terms, but like in a very much more like not rudimentary, but in English, I guess, what you're seeing and how someone else can apply it to their work who doesn't have that same background as you.
Mark or Caroline, any
Sure.
job titles, skills?
Yeah, I'll share. Echoing everything Claire said, there are job titles that you see a lot, but even when you see the same job title at two companies, you cannot assume that that is the same kind of work. The one I like to tell people about is like there are some companies that have analytical linguists and there are some companies that have computational linguists and some have both. And I've known people whose job title was analytical linguist, but they were writing and training models all day. And I've known people whose job title was computational linguist and they were not coding. So it's not even clear how those are going to play out. There are companies that are hiring prompt engineers. And when it first started, I think all the buzz was like they're hiring prompt engineers and paying them $400,000 a year or something like that. And I don't know what those jobs were like, but my sense now is that I think companies are not even really sure what expertise is kind of most important for prompt engineering. And I have a lot of colleagues who are machine learning engineers who have reported to me that a lot of jobs that were formerly machine learning engineer jobs, they're now kind of just thinking that you'll write prompts and build prompting systems instead. Whereas, and there are some technical pieces to that are really kind of not entry-level coding stuff. And so it is maybe outside of the range of a lot of linguists, starting capabilities, not that you couldn't learn, but yeah, but then there are other positions where I think they do just want someone to write the prompts. And then in that case, I think that linguist could be really effective, but I'd be a little bit wary, like Claire said, about like, what do they really want here? If they don't quite know that they need linguists, if they're not excited about bringing linguists on, then, of course, apply. I think it's always worth letting the recruiting team make their decision, do their job, but definitely don't get your hopes up, I guess. As for skills, the other thing that I think is really critical is being able to provide recommendations based on possibly incomplete data or stuff that feels super subjective or, basically any of these generalizing things. As Claire said, when you're working with collaborators, they either don't have time or don't care about linguistics. They don't want to learn more about it really. And so you don't have that much time. I found as a former academic that this was like the new frontier for me, is that I'm talking to people about linguistics who don't have time or don't care about it. And that was new because it was always either fellow faculty or students who were like invested in understanding, and they come and listen for 45 minutes. You just don't have that time. So I think being able to say like, okay, I've spent 10 to 20 hours working with this data set that's the result of our system. How can I tell people what I think needs to change about it in a way that's they're going to understand, and also always thinking first about recommendations. So not just saying, here are the problems I see, but also trying to think about, here are my thoughts about how we might solve this. And that's where that's where like general, broad, foundational understanding of how these systems work. I can't write the code, but I understand basically how these things get built. And that helps me to tell machine learning folks, like, what if we did this? What if we did this to try to solve this problem that I'm identifying?
I won't add too much because Claire and Mark put it all so perfectly. But I think I would definitely +1 on making your explanations concise, and kind of waiting for someone to ask you more if they are curious to understand more. And I would add on that another skill set that can be really helpful is taxonomization. Because for a lot of AI engineers, a prompt is a prompt is a prompt and is a prompt, but you want a way of defining the scope and the depth of what you're actually testing and why, to make sure that you're covering all the kind of axes of variation that are relevant for your potential use case. And also learning, I think it can be overwhelming working in this field because there's just new papers and new models coming out constantly. And so having the expectation that you're just going to know and understand everything that's happening with all the new tech is not always realistic, but just getting the fundamentals of machine learning is really, really helpful so that you can have a bit of an instinct to understand what these models are capable of and what they're not. And in terms of the job postings, it can really be so different across the board. Everything Claire and Mark said, I would definitely agree with. Things like AI analysts and data engineers might lead you somewhere. I feel like generally postings that refer more and more to you're working with the data, not the models, or like the output quality, model quality. That's more likely to be something that a linguist can like really, really fit well in. But usually it's great to just talk to people in those roles at those companies to understand what they actually mean by that job title, because it can differ so much.
That's excellent. So we did have one question about in the chat here about on-the-job training. So because this is relatively new, the question is, do companies expect, or do organizations expect, that you will come in knowing how to do things, from start to finish, or is there an expectation that you'll get some sort of training? Do folks have any experience?
I'll start with this one. I think well, yeah, it's unlikely, I think, that they would bring on someone who had no knowledge, even sort of abstract knowledge, and no kind of experience, even like playing with ChatGPT, let's say, as some level of experience, someone who is totally green. I think that's really unlikely. But I think the way I would recommend people approach this is, again, let the hiring team do its job. So apply for these jobs if you're interested in them. Obviously, try to study if you're interested in getting these jobs. And then if throughout the interview process, it becomes clear to them that you don't have the skill set they're looking for, then they'll pass, and you will be happy about that result, because if they want someone who's not you, you don't want to be in that seat every day having people say like, okay, can you like fine tune a new version of this model for us by tomorrow? And you're like, Googling fine tune ? So I think just obviously continue to learn and pursue these things that you want to pursue, but encourage you to apply for the jobs, because it's also not even clear from the job description. Sometimes they're generic. They have a team of AI engineers, let's say, and they need some of them to be really tech forward, and they need some of them to be really linguistics forward. And the job posting doesn't make it clear, and you don't even know, but the team knows who they're looking for. And so then you get into the interview and you find out, oh shoot, this was a tech focused role, and that's where my skill set is lacking, right? So anyway, all of this is to say that like you should absolutely learn, but you shouldn't necessarily be scared off by the job posting.
Yeah, I had similar experiences. I think the way I would describe it is I've had to hit the ground running basically with all my jobs, but all the jobs I've worked for, they did really like the knowledge that I had coming in with the linguistics. So in terms of linguistics and looking at the data and patterns, I've always hit the ground running with that. But recently I've been given like lots of opportunities to learn on the job for the other things. So like AWS cloud, like so Amazon, like all that stuff, like a lot more technical stuff I get to learn on the job because they have other staff members that are experts in that. So I get to hear what they're doing every day and start kind of learning what the more techie stuff is. But so yeah, but I think that's how I describe it, hit the ground running with my expertise, but then learning about all the other stuff I'm not the expert in by conversing with teammates and stuff.
Yeah, in my experience, there's been a ton of learning on the job, which has been really fun to be able to do outside of a school context. But like Mark said, it's often unclear just from the job posting. Usually the hiring team has a very specific, concrete idea of what they need to hire, what knowledge they need you to have upon hiring versus what they're okay with you learning on the job. And you sometimes don't learn that until a little bit later on. Even if you do talk to some people, it just like pops up later. And you can be like, oh, well, if I knew that, I would have studied that in advance. But one thing that I found to be really helpful is looking at other people at the company who have that same role or who used to have that same role and what their experience was and what their skill sets were, to see like where I might have like major gaps. And then anytime you can sort of pick up a project where you currently are that emulates things that you think will be needed in the job you want after this, that really, really helps if you can just prove out like, okay, I have experience on a project that has these elements of this type of job function that I really want. And even doing things like going on YouTube and hearing people at the company, especially in your job function or team, talk about what the company does and what their work is like, and see how well you can follow along with the content. And usually that'll give you like a long, like 20 tabs worth of things you're Googling and learning about. That's very specific to what the day-to-day would be like.
Yeah, that's great. I think maybe we'll tackle one more question that Emily has told me people have asked, and then open it up to questions from everyone. So the question that I've been asked to ask is, what is going on with natural language processing in the era of GenAI and LLMs? Is NLP still a thing? Is NLU the thing? What are the things? So let's see. Caroline, would you like to start on this one?
Is the question, sorry, I got distracted by the emojis coming out of Mark's head.
No. Yeah. No, the question is just what's going, this is a lot of natural language technology. That's what an LLM is. There used to be a field dedicated to that called natural language processing, or there still is, or it's changed, or what do folks have a feel for what is going on with NLP these days? Is it being taken over by GenAI? Is it not? Yeah, that's the question.
I think at a broad level, some of it is being eviscerated a little bit with GenAI, but at the same time, kind of old school NLP methodologies are also still necessary and still very much in fashion, especially the closer you get to people who are really focused on like edge cases and, as Mark said, like breaking the system, the more you need to get down into the nitty gritty and you need to use some tools that are less glamorous sounding than most of the Gen AI deep learning stuff, but are still very, very valuable. It's just not always as flashy. And I've found that in the far research realm, there tends to be a little bit less of NLP. And then as you go closer into AI as like a product that's like very practical and therefore looking more and more at like error modes, that's where you see more of traditional NLP being used. But probably on a whole underappreciated right now.
Yeah, I agree a lot with Caroline. It's underappreciated, and I think people are putting it now under the umbrella of AI. So sometimes when I need to explain an NLP concept to someone, I might just say it's an AI concept, and they're more quick to be like, oh yeah, sure, I kind of get what realm you're talking about. So unfortunate, I think it is kind of unfortunate because it's like it is nicer to say like this is a natural language processing methodology, but yeah, I think it's no longer a buzzword. I think at one point it definitely was, but now it's not as much as AI, GenAI, and all those other acronyms.
The way that I've really thought about it is I still really believe that all of these other technologies are valuable. And that's mostly because sometimes you need components that are controllable. You need components that are going to sort of do what you say in a way. Like I mentioned with that LinkedIn post that I talked about, really giving LinkedIn some free press in this call. But it was really interesting the way that they talked about, okay, the prompt is an incredibly valuable part of this pipeline, but it is part of a pipeline. And that pipeline allows us to do so many great things. I think one of the big things that this did is, like I said, it made prototyping so fast. And so you can envision a new user experience like that. And then, you know, the only blocker is building out the UI or whatever, because you can get something that works, I would say, most of the time. Sort of funny. Sometimes I talk to folks, you know, working with prompts, and they're like, well, if it's total garbage, then we won't use the prompt. And I'm like, well, that's the whole thing, is that it's never total garbage. I think actually most of the time, like, prompts do better than chance on things. And so I often feel like, well, if your pipeline is going to have nothing or it's going to have a prompt, you might as well put the prompt in there, because it's likely to have better results than doing nothing on the system at all. But it just squishes that, like, that intelligence development timeline to be almost nothing. And so that makes these other things that take time to build out, that take this infrastructure. You know, it used to be that there was no faster way to do it. And so the folks that you work with as an intelligence person, product managers and other folks who are like, let's go faster, you know, let's get this shipped, let's do this. You know, before they were like, that's how long it takes. I don't really know what else we can do. We need to build out the system. But now it kind of looks like you don't have to do that. And so there's a lot more like trying to get space. I like Claire's idea of just calling all of these things AI. I think that's brilliant. But what I'm also seeing is that the quality bar, in order to get from 70% to 80%, I think you do have to do more than just use one prompt. Maybe it's a suite of prompts, or maybe it's other technologies as well. That's one piece where I think it's really important. And the other piece too is to not forget that you can also use these tools for analysis. So if I'm trying to identify items in a data set that are most likely to be informative for the task I'm looking for, maybe there are some rule-based things I can do to create here. Maybe it's actually worth investing in a simple trained classifier, or, you know, using a prompt to classify and then kind of correcting some of those or something like that. Those tools are also useful there, even if I think they are being used less in the actual production pipelines. But I think the AI features that I see that are the most interesting to me out in the world, I feel pretty certain that there is something more than just a prompt behind those things. And I think we're still in the early days where we don't quite yet know what's going to be successful. And I think it's going to be the things that use the whole toolkit, that don't view this as a replacement, but review it as an addition to what we could use before.
That's great. Yeah. For folks who are entering this this world, about every 10 years, the definition of what artificial intelligence is changes. So in like the 70s and 80s, it was a bunch of hand-coded rules written by an expert, and then it becomes, you know, machine learning, deep learning. So you know, don't get too attached to a single definition of something like AI because it'll change in about a decade. Yeah. Okay. So we with the time we have left, I thought we might open it up to questions. Does anyone have a question? I don't know if there's a format for asking these questions. Carolyn?
Hi, I just have a quick question. I noticed, like on all of your websites or LinkedIn, that you have all of you almost have or had leadership positions, and I've seen leadership positions like other roles that involve some like leadership. But I was wondering, first of all, what was the trajectory to get there? What if it was like an active sort of decision to work towards that? And if there is if there are positions that right now having like the specific technical skills in education, if like as a recent graduate we can apply for something that would lead us to positions like that. Thank you.
I think for me, the one leadership I had came out of the experience first. So I was a prompt engineer, and then I became a leader of prompt engineers. So having that experience in the prompt engineering space and looking at there's a bit of data work too, was where my leadership skills, I guess, came through. I think one of the biggest things about being a leader is just being able to make decisions. And that was something I was really doing a lot at the time, was making decisions, not just like my decisions, but advocating for my other team members' decisions as well, and saying like, hey, this is a really good idea, let's run with that, and so forth. So I think coming in, understanding what the position is of the members that you would be leading, I think is really valuable. And then moving up to a leadership position is just my experience.
I really like, Claire, how you called out how like part of, I think, being in a leadership position is listening a lot to your team members around you and making sure that their input is getting heard. I feel like in general, I've noticed that whenever you want a position, you have to kind of start doing it where you are now in order to be kind of seen as eligible to then actually officially get that role. And so I think how that happens with leadership is it's like starting to think of your work beyond your slice and what you're directly responsible for. So both in that you're not waiting to be told what to do, but you're really thinking about what's the most important thing for me to be doing and why. So you can almost like be assigning yourself work. And then also like the more big picture you can think about how your work plays into the larger team, the larger project, the larger organization, and taking more and more ownership of what your work contributes to and how everything else is doing. I feel like that's kind of the signals of a leader, is someone that's taking ownership over the bigger picture and wants to kind of play a part, not just by getting their voice heard, but making sure that kind of everyone's voice is getting us to the best spot possible.
I don't have anything to add. Those are great answers.
That's same. I don't know that I've ever been a leader of anything. But yeah, I guess the only thing I would add is that sometimes just sticking around, you know, for a while, eventually you're kind of the most senior person. People look to you like, well, what should we do? We just got here a year ago, and you said, well, I've been here 5 years. So sometimes it just kind of happens sui generis. You don't really do much. Yeah, very good question. Thank you, Preston. Any other questions?
Hey, so one thing that I've noticed that's kind of a reoccurring question that I've been seeing is about how you can sort of get this prompt engineering experience sort of on your own when you're not like sort of a part of an organization or institution. So I'm curious if any of the panelists sort of have any tips or tricks on how to get experience with prompt engineering on your own?
I know there are a lot of certificates out now. I feel like that's one way to do it. I was learning prompt engineering before all those certificates became a thing. So the project that I had mentioned, it was about just like creating that GPT model for my own resume. That was where I was doing a lot. Like I would spend like a full day and full 8 hours just tweaking the prompt a bit here and there. So I would recommend that, like, try to find a project that you want to do. So at that time I was out of a job. I was like, but I knew I wanted to do tech, so I knew I needed to learn a bit of tech. So I was trying to create my own website, and just having that project and having that like end goal in mind made the project fun and engaging. So I was able to do it day in, day out like a full-time job. And that gave me the space to learn the prompt engineering as much as possible.
I think I often think about this too, and it's unfortunate because these tools they're not free, right? I don't know, like I actually don't know how much it costs to mess around with GPT API calls. So maybe it's actually totally affordable and it's fine. But I think that if the doing a project thing is great, and that's basically what I'm recommending too. But if you're at a point where you're like, okay, I know I'm supposed to do a project, maybe what Claire just described feels like too hard for me right now. So what's like a simpler thing I can do? I think, or I would like to believe that just understanding more what these systems do is really valuable. I mean, I've built up my experience just through on the job, but like I've been looking at GPT output for, over 18 months now. And there are things that I see where I'm like, oh my God, that's classic GPT. And there are things that I see where I'm like, whoa, that's so weird. Why is it even doing that? Something just came up this week where I was like, I truly do not understand why this is happening. But that's through exposure. That's through like, okay, I'm going to write a prompt. I'm going to generate it 100 times, and I'm going to look at all the outputs and try to identify patterns and try to see where it's failing, where it's succeeding, these kinds of things. That experience of getting to know these systems and how they work, I think is what I would recommend for folks who are not currently working a job that has prompting but want to understand more prompting. That, and of course, reading any kinds of guides and stuff that you can find online. Like Caroline said, there are so many papers now, and the papers are really good too, but often they're like so focused that it's not as much about breadth, but you still can get some stray lessons about like how these things behave from some of those papers that can be really useful for whenever you're approaching like a new project.
Yeah, I don't have too much helpful to add because that was all perfect. One very small thing I just Googled, and it looks like there are prompt hackathons or prompt engineering hackathons. I don't know exactly what that entails, but it could be a good way to learn alongside other people and have it be project-based. But I would definitely agree that like intimacy and experience with just using these tools and having actual intent on your side and seeing what happens as you change your own prompts is a good way at minimum to get started.
And another thing that we might think about is two things. One is these things spit out language. They just blah, 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 loads and loads and loads of language. And we are linguists and we analyze language. So that might be an interesting thing to do, like analyze, whatever is your sort of hobby horse within linguistics, what do the models do with that? Probe like weird edge cases, island constraints, and all sorts of like fun things like that. Co-referenced resolution, anything like that. That's one thing. And another thing that came to mind is, they had these kind of like on the subject of hackathons, like sort of data science for social good and organizations that are looking for people to come in and do free work. And I think, I don't know this for sure, but my guess is if you said to them, look, I would love to work on your project on doing, whatever sort of good and noble thing you're doing, but I would also like to document what I do so that I can show it to potential employers. You might be able to help someone and get an artifact that you could show to an employer to demonstrate your expertise in this area. Those are just two small things that came to mind. Alfonso.
Yeah, thank you. Sorry, just this is there we go. Hello. Well, thank you all. It was very interesting. Actually, it was more of a follow-up. It's not a question, and I think just if I may share, when as part of my position, I've been doing a lot of prompt writing as well, and kind of something that falls within the understanding of prompt engineering from a linguistic perspective. And I think what you mentioned at the very end, Chris, before, like a lot of what I was doing, like evaluating the outcome of that LLM that Amazon has been building and still is building, it was a lot of work that I felt that I could contribute a lot to through my linguistic experience. So things like collocations, like sometimes I was kind of evaluating and assessing what we got in the response, in the hypothetical LLM response, or the actual LLM response. And it was the tiny little details that in some cases you actually know how to identify, like lexical substitution, like things that people may not be fully aware of, that but you, after like being exposed to reading and like being very precise about terminology and words and many things like that, actually turn you into a very proficient prompt engineer, kind of writer, or someone who writes very good prompts. So I would say that maybe we shouldn't get like very discouraged by the idea of engineering, that I think it might be a little bit like putting off for some people, especially coming from a humanities background. And I think that we do have a lot of the skills that, like are required to actually do this type of job. So yeah, it was just to add. So thank you.
Yes, Mark.
Okay, I'm going to ask a question and I'm going to answer it first. And this question is, what is your, if you had to give one lesson about prompting for folks, about some like commonly misunderstood thing or something, what would you say? And my thing is that, at least working with GPT, prompts are not, I can say they're not additive, they're holistic. So if you have a prompt, we'll call it prompt A, that kind of does a lot of things that you like, but then it does this one thing X that you don't like. And you're like, I want it to stop doing X, but otherwise be the same. You can't just add a line to your prompt that says, and don't do X, and assume that your output will be like prompt A, but also it doesn't do X. In fact, you'll just get prompt B, a new prompt that does whatever it does. Hopefully, it does X less than before, although there's some of the earlier models, if you told them not to do something, it would prime them and they would go, what a fun idea, and do it. But it does something different, and it might improve on X, but it might do worse on some of the other things that were working good before. So it is like, if you're just working with one prompt, it is really kind of more holistic. And when you make changes to it, you just got to keep in mind that it could change things that are totally unrelated to the changes that you made to the prompt. And I feel like I see this as a misunderstanding that folks run into sometimes. So what about you, Caroline or Claire? Does anything come to mind?
Yes, in terms of like one way to approach prompt engineering, I see it as like the first thing I always look for is ambiguity. And like, yeah, so the process of creating a prompt is very, very iterative, but that's always like my number one search is like, are there any ambiguous statements, or is there anything that can be interpreted differently than how I'm interpreting it? I think I just found that in one of my prompts today. I'm trying to think if I can remember it correctly. Oh yeah, I said like give me a, I don't know if I can word it quickly, but I realized the sentence could be interpreted in a completely different way than how I had originally written it. So yeah, ambiguity or multiple meanings. Yeah, that would be what I would search for first.
Yeah, that's a really, really good point. I feel like with prompting in general, it's actually helped me elsewhere at work and even just in my life, because it requires you to ask for exactly what you need and like define it in very precise, unambiguous terms, which I feel like is a nice life skill in general. But that was also daunting to me. I realized that my kind of thought process in general when doing something is it's less all planned out in the beginning and it's more I figure it out as I go along. So that has also kind of turned into my prompting approach as well, is rather than having everything explained up front of exactly what I need, I more do it kind of in lockstep with the system. And then I also feel like I can more easily sense that we're on the same page. It like goes along more easily with the way my brain thinks, and I can see that we're on the same page as where we're trying to get to. If it's more of a dialogue of, okay, this and then that and then that. So I think working with how your mind likes to work and collaborate as well is a good way to explore the different prompting strategies.
That's great. One thing I would add here just really quickly is, I think people seem to sometimes view the models as very kind of like, there's this mysterious thing that lurks behind the cursor and you just send something off and you get something back. But in reality, there are models that are very expensive to run and there are models that are much cheaper to run. There are models that are fast and there are models that are slow. If you work in an organization and you have a use case that you want to use an LLM for and do some prompt engineering, well, it could be that your project is not high priority. And so people say, well, no, that costs too much and we're not going to do it. Or it could be that it is super high priority and that you have to do it by tomorrow. And so there's lots of different, I think if you're sort of looking from the outside in, you think, oh, there's people who just sit around and write prompts all day long, and that sounds like a cool job. But in reality, it's much more messy when you go to implement these things, productionize them. There are lots and lots and lots of things to consider that maybe aren't apparent upfront, that all mostly have to do with like sort of business and engineering requirements. Anyway, yeah, that was fun. I think that there's a few questions in the chat that maybe we might attend to. So one that I saw is, what excites you about your job? That seems to have kicked off some interest in the chat. Claire, would you like to talk about what excites you?
Yeah, sure. I'm working with a lot of software engineers, and I am the only one with a linguistics degree on my team. So just being able to show them this like linguistic side of tech that I think's becoming a bigger and bigger thing is really exciting to me. Like, I think I'm gonna have my first presentation next week basically on it. And yeah, it's just really exciting to teach others that like linguistics is relevant and here's how I'm using it to help the team. And yeah, I've already had a few like really positive responses from it. So that's what I like.
I'd say for me, I guess there's two main things. I mean, maybe there's three. One is the amount of which I've been able to learn on the job is really, really incredible. I feel very lucky for just how much new content I'm able to be exposed to. And it's fun working on technology that is constantly changing. It keeps you on your toes and it's stressful, but you'll never get bored and you'll never feel stunted of opportunities to learn new things. And with linguistics, often it's a matter of like sneaking it in, but almost all of my linguistics experience, including things that I never thought would be useful to me ever again, like, fieldwork processes and approaches, or like very specific phonetic rules, have been really, really relevant and useful. And I also think that, especially working with data, like with AI in general, we've really indexed on compute and on volume, data volume, model size, and architecture, and like really, really kind of squeezed a lot of juice out of those angles. And I think data diversity is one of the last frontiers that we haven't cracked super well, that can like push the model performance into whole new levels. And I think linguists are in such a great position to be able to do that, because you need someone who can actually like grasp and sculpt and like define out the data along these axes. And it's very cool to feel like a skill set that is often underappreciated or just unknown. It can actually be key to like the next phase in AI.
The way that I like to put it is being cozy with language is like still something that I feel like I'm doing. And I like that I also say that every week I either do something that's fun, funny, or interesting with language. Maybe some weeks I do all three. Maybe some weeks I'm just laughing at an extremely stupid output from GenAI, like whatever it is. And that like totally scratches the itch that I have to engage with language and think about language all the time. And that was true when I was an academic, and that's still true now, and I still sort of get to. And I've also gained a bigger appreciation for the stuff that was not like the particulars of the theory of distributed morphology, right? Like I just, when I approach looking at language data, the mind is immediately on. I'm immediately thinking what's worth looking at, what's not worth looking at. I'm super sensitive to things that other folks might be like, oh, like a coworker came to me the other day and he was using AI to like refine his reviews, like we were doing our review cycle, and he was like, what do you think? And I was like, well, it totally looks like AI. And he was like, oh, really? I thought it was pretty good. And I was like, well, yeah, I mean, it's fine, but it's very obvious that you wrote this with AI. And he was like, okay, well, I'm fine with that, you know. So I just think that it's still like scratching those same itches, and there's still so much discovery. There's so much discovery to be done. And yes, sometimes there is stuff that's frustrating for sure, but there is still so much discovery. It keeps me intellectually stimulated, and I'm very happy about that.
I would just add to that what I've seen is that linguists in tech often straddle the business engineering divide. Not that there's really a divide per se. I mean, I don't mean to over dramatize it, but if you can speak a little bit of each, so you understand like engineering requirements, but you also understand what the business priorities are, that can be a fun place to hang out because you can be very effective. You're sort of like a quasi-engineer, but you're also like a quasi sort of PME sort project manager. And that can be a fun place to hang out and build a career. So yeah, just adding on to those things. We only have a few minutes left. There's a question about maybe I'll just ask two. Maybe I'll say if anyone wants to tackle either of these questions. So one of the questions was, do you work from home or from a larger office? Do you have any principled preference for this particular job? And then the other was something along the lines of like, is AI working for or against creatives? People who write things. Is this kind of yeah? I don't know if people are willing to weigh in there. That maybe not something that your employer wants you to talk about. So hand it with kid gloves if you want. But yeah, anyone want to talk about where they work from, why that might be particularly pertinent to a prompt engineer, or what AI is doing for creatives, for authors and writers and those sorts.
I can speak quickly to both of them. The first one is I work from home all the time. We have one R&D day, research and development day, where you can go into the office and like work with someone else for the day, or like get to know someone else that you might not work with side by side a lot. In terms of working from home, I'm more introverted, so I really, really like it. But when I go in the office, it is a lot of fun. I think I build up enough extroversion for that month for the day to really enjoy it when I am in the office. So I do like that balance. In terms of creativity, I found again on LinkedIn, like someone used the analogy of when the camera was invented, it didn't deter from painting artists, like artists doing paint or sketching. It just created a new form of art, which is like pictures, photography. So I do think that's going to be where AI comes into play. It'll be its own field of this is AI generated written work. This is AI art. Like I love looking at AI art, but I still have a huge appreciation for painting and artwork that's not AI generated. So that's the analogy I like to think about when people ask about the creativity. I'm like, no, I think it'll just be its own department of creativity is with AI. Yeah.
I don't
Otherwise,
want to
we-
steal the last 1 minute, but I'll quickly say in terms of where I work remotely mostly. But I'm actually planning to move to the Bay Area so that I can work hybrid. I find as a product manager, being in person is really helpful because so much of your job is getting people who have very different perspectives and goals and opinions to be on the same page and on board with something. That's really hard to accomplish remotely, and also hard to know if you've accomplished it remotely. And I think just like the human element is nice if you need to work through a hard problem. It's just easier. People are more present with all their brains together in person. But then for getting a lot of stuff actually done, working from home is a really, really nice luxury to have. And with the creatives, I think we're out of time, so I know there's not enough time to do this justice. Ideally, these tools are being built and used to help people do their work rather than replace people. And will keep humans like on that frontier of what humans are really, really great at, and will help us realize and recognize what humans are amazing at. And I think it's very like art is important because it's made by humans. So yeah, not doing justice to that question, but there's a lot of potential good, and I think a lot of protection that needs to be put into place.
I saw an ad that said, AI generated this ad, but it can't make you homemade noodles.
Yeah.
So, yeah, can't do everything.